Thanks everyone for coming out to support, so we can support each other for preaching scripture today. So, quick question: who here is a movie buff? Would you proclaim yourself to be a movie buff? Yeah, I'm not one of those people. I'm notorious for having seen very few movies in my lifetime, to the point where, with my friends, it's pretty much a joke. They'll go, "Hey, have you seen that scene where?" Oh no, wait, you haven't because you don't watch movies. Despite the rumors, despite my cinema illiteracy, I have seen some movies. I've seen a few of the classics and whatever else I find to be interesting. It's not very much. But one of the ones that I have seen, and one of my personal favorites, is the Indiana Jones series, right? I'm one of the rare few that likes all of them. You can critique me on that later, that's fine. But I think my personal favorite out of the four would be Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? Classic movie, one of the cinema classics, right? The main premise of the movie, Indiana Jones is going up against the Nazis. They're trying to find the Ark of the Covenant. No one knows where it went after the Old Testament, so they're trying to find it. They both have their own kind of agenda for it. The Nazis want to find it because they think it's this big, powerful super weapon that they can use to win the war. And Indiana Jones wants it because it belongs in a museum. All right. So they both have this agenda of why they want to find the Ark. Neither of which is really the right reason for finding the Ark, right? The Ark was this symbol of God's holiness in the Old Testament. Neither one of them recognize that. Neither one of them say, I want to find this to restore the holiness of God. They both have their own agenda for it. And this isn't the only time that's ever happened in history. There's been a few times where people have misused the Ark or captured the Ark for their own reasons. And that's what we're going to look at today. And you will notice still that they're not keeping the Ark in its full holiness, or God in his full holiness either. They are using it for their own agenda. And what we're going to see through it is God's saying he must be the only holy thing in their life. And he is going to assert himself as holy as such. So we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 5. Before that, real quick, I'll give a little bit of history background of what's the situation going on here. The Israelites were at war with the Philistines again. They tend to do that quite a bit. And this time they were losing. They were losing the battle. They were not doing very well against the Philistines. This is in chapter 4, right beforehand. And they say to themselves, we're losing. We have to do something about this, right? So instead of going to God in prayer and saying, God, we need your help. We need you to help us win this battle because you're God and we're your people. Help us out. They instead say, no, let's go grab the Ark and let's go bring it to the battlefield, and God will just kill all our enemies for us. It's going to be fantastic. They do this, and God is not amused. God does not cater to their demands. He's not some kind of super weapon they can just use for their own agenda. So they lose, spectacularly so. They just get wiped out. And the Philistines come up and they take the Ark. It's a pretty common practice back in the day to claim your enemy's idol or their god, quote unquote, as your own to take it back to your temple. So they take the Ark, the Israelites lose, and they go home. They pack up and go home, whoever's left alive. And the Philistines bring the Ark back to their homeland. So we'll start off in chapter 5. Verse 1 says, when the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. And the Philistines took the Ark of God and brought it into the house of Dagon and set it beside Dagon. And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the Ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen face down on the ground before the Ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. So the Philistines, they take the Ark and they put it in the temple with Dagon. It was kind of what they would do back in that day to say, our God helped conquer these people. Now this God will help us conquer even more people, right? And God is not amused, once again. God's getting the Ark of the Covenant, and God's getting thrown around all these different places by these different people who think they can use him for their own agenda, and he's going to put them in their place. So the next day, the Philistines walk into the temple, and look at that. Dagon's lying on the ground. He's not just laying on the ground, though. He's laying, face downward towards the Ark of the Covenant. Now, you'd think to yourself, these guys, they can't be that stupid, right? They have to realize there's something going on here with Dagon and the Ark, right? But no, they say, Dagon fell down, what you going to do? So they put him back up, and they would make. I would assume it's made out of stone, like a stone idol. It doesn't state whether or not it is, but if you're going to make an idol, you want to make it something out of glass, right? So they have to take this huge idol, and they have to heave it up. You ever seen those weightlifting contests of those guys with those huge stones and they're straining to pick it up and all that? I can only imagine that's what's going on here. And the cruel irony of this is that the Philistines have to take their God, quote unquote, and restore him to his place of holiness because he can't do it himself, right? He's just this stone idol that the people worship. So he needs the people's help to get back to his place of holiness, right? Does that sound familiar at all? Do we, you ever think to yourself, I have to go do this thing for God, or, his glory is not going to get out there. They're not going to hear about this, right? People aren't going to know who God is. Here's the thing. God's going to assert his holiness no matter what we do. God doesn't need to use us. And God's holiness is not dependent on our service to him. God is holy no matter what we do, right? He will accomplish his will with or without us. That doesn't mean God doesn't want us to worship him and to serve him, right? He wants us to be alongside him in that process. But, even if we don't do the will of God, if we think God's telling us to go do something, and we say, I don't want to do that, but the will of God's not going to be accomplished if I do, or if I don't do it, right? Well, it will, and if you don't do it, at that point, you're just sinning against God. You're just not doing what he wants you to do. He's still going to accomplish his will no matter what. You have the privilege of being a part of his plan and his tool to accomplish that goal. So, anyways, the Philistines, back to the Philistines. They put Dagon back up, and they say, all right, we're all well and good. Let's continue this worship of Dagon. So they leave, and the next day they come back in, and they see Dagon has fallen once again. And you'd think to yourself, big stone like this falling onto the floor, probably it would break, right? Not surprising that it would break into different pieces. And it would be kind of fitting for God to shatter Dagon into just multiple pieces, scatter him around, saying, I am God, I will assert myself over this idol. But God's a little more clever than that. He's a little more... It's ironic the way he does this. So, and Dagon has fallen again, face down, but this time both hands and the head of Dagon are cut off. And back in this time period of history, cutting off of hands and of a head were not uncommon in warfare. They would kind of be considered trophies. There's a story of, I can't remember exactly where it was. I read it briefly of there was a story people had of one of their conquerors who wore the hands of their enemies on their belt. It's very gruesome. It's a little, nowadays we're kind of that's kind of gross. I don't want to wear a hand as a trophy, just notch my rifle instead. But this is what they did back in the day. It was to keep a trophy of their kill and to a body count as well. So, I've killed 15 people in battle, right? So God takes the hands and the head of Dagon as his war trophy. He is asserting himself over this false idol that the Philistines have, right? And God has this pattern of bringing those down who don't recognize him and don't idolize him as the only holy God, right? He does this with the Israelites. He's about to do it with the Philistines. We'll get there in a minute, right? And I would say he does it a lot today too. You don't have to look very far in the news or Christian media to see stories of pastors who for one reason or another have fallen from their position of authority. I think the one that really kind of hit me hard a couple years ago was Bill Hybels, where he got involved. There was a scandal of sexual misconduct in his church, and really just brought the leadership of his church just crumbling. It was tragic because I've read a lot of Bill Hybels, and I think he's got some great stuff to write. But just hearing that this had happened to a guy who built one of the largest churches in America, it was startling. And I'm convinced that the reason these pastors and church leaders, and it can happen to any of us, fall into this, they allow their sin to overcome them and to bring them down, is because they're not making room in their heart for one God. They have God and something, God and whatever else I want in my life, right? It's unfortunate, and it's really quite sad to see that happen to anyone. And that's why we have to be careful. We're not bringing God into the temple of our hearts along with our idol, right? We have to make sure God gets his temple. He doesn't get something else in there. We don't bring something else in to help dictate our lives like the Philistines did. And then in the last verse 5 here, it says, the priests of Dagon who enter the house, they don't tread on the threshold of Dagon to that day. They just didn't step over it. Like the head and the hands had kind of fallen there, and they hop over where they had fallen to not disrespect Dagon. It's fantastically ironic because they realize, God has broken this thing for us, but they still don't recognize him as holy. They're like, no, our God is holy. We're not going to disrespect him. And that plays a part later on in Israel's history. In Zephaniah, there's reference to idolatrous priests in the nation of Israel who step over the threshold. It's just kind of a tie-in to Israel's idolatry, right? So we see that God is asserting himself as the Holy One, the only Holy One, right? And the next logical step is we must accept him as holy, right? So verse 6, the hand of the Lord was heavy against the people of Ashdod. He terrified and afflicted them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territory. And when the men of Ashdod saw how things were, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon our God. So they sent and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, what shall we do with the ark of the God of Israel? They answered, let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath. So they brought the ark of the God of Israel there. But after they had brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against the city, causing a very great panic, and he afflicted the men of the city, both young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. But as soon as the ark of God came to Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out, they have brought around to us the ark of the God of Israel to kill us and our people. They sent, therefore, and gathered together all the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of the God of Israel and let it return to its own place, that it may not kill us and our people. For there was a deathly panic throughout the whole city. The hand of God was very heavy there. The men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. So we see the taking of the hands once again plays into the irony that God has. It says the hand of God was heavy against the people there, right? God is asserting he has taken the hands of Dagon. He says, I am the only one who has hands to lay upon these people their punishment. So Dagon can't help you. He has no power. He has no hands to assert himself with. So with his hands, God lays on them a plague, right? It says that they were struck with tumors. A lot of scholars think that these tumors may have been a symptom of the bubonic plague, because in the Septuagint, actually, in verse 6, it mentions rats, and rats were the carrier of the bubonic plague, the Black Death that happened. I don't remember when. I'm not a history guy, but hugely dangerous and painful disease. The tumors. They could have been, the way they interpret it is the lymph nodes of a person's body would swell up when they have the bubonic plague, so like in the neck and like the armpits, like all those places, and they'd be huge, like painful lumps, right? So they think that could have been what was happening to the people here. It's a little bit gross. But either way, if it was the bubonic plague or if it wasn't, doesn't really matter. What matters is that God is punishing these people because they are not respecting him and not holding him to the holiness that he demands. And so, and they recognize this too. They say the God of Israel is afflicting us and, punishing us. What are we going to do about this, right? The logical thing to do would be to worship God and recognize him for who he is. But they say, no, let's just take the ark and give it to this other city, right? We don't want it in our city anymore because it's causing our people harm. So they take it to Gath, and then the people there start getting tumors, and they're starting to get sick. Imagine if it was the bubonic plague, a bunch of rats start showing up too. It's kind of gross and a sign that this is not going well for us. So they say, once again, we got to get rid of this thing. It's causing us harm. Let's send it to this other city. And the other city gets word of this, and they're like, they're going to kill us. They're just sending it to us to die. So there's just a huge panic, and people are suffering. And just what they just don't understand is that, if they just would recognize God as holy and respect him for it, this wouldn't be happening to them. It sounds familiar to me for what we do a lot of the time, right? Instead of observing God as holy in all aspects of our life, a lot of the times we will push him to the side to accomplish our own agenda. The biggest one for me right now, it was a couple years ago anyways, was like people watch Game of Thrones, and I would talk to Christians all the time, like, yeah, I watch Game of Thrones, do you watch Game of Thrones? It's like, no, I did not. Like, I can't in good conscience watch that because there's just so much, like, there's so much immorality in it. How can you stand that? Like, I don't, and it was amazing to me how many people I would talk to who were like, oh yeah, it's great. It's just, if you just ignore those other parts, I'm like, how do you ignore that? It's like half the show. So they're just kind of shoving God to the side to indulge in a few minutes of TV or whatever it is. They're willing to put him to the side to sin against him, right? And you know what we do? And there's many aspects we do that. I'm not saying I'm perfect either. There's areas in my life where I will say, I'm not going to pay attention to God for a minute so I can go do this other thing, right? Everyone's guilty of that. Everyone's done it. Everyone has sinned. And you know what we deserve? We deserve rats running around. We deserve the bubonic plague or tumors or whatever this punishment that God has been dishing out to the people there. We deserve the exact same thing. But God, that's one of my favorite phrases in the Bible, but God, or but. He said, people, they have this problem. They can't fix it themselves. I'm going to help them fix it, right? So God sent Jesus so that we don't have to get the plague, so that we don't have to suffer the wrath of his punishment for disregarding his holiness, right? By following Jesus and saying, I trust in you to take my sin away, the stuff that I can control and I can't control, because we sin even when we don't know we're sinning, right? It's just human nature, right? We can't control that. And to get the plague for something you didn't even know you did, that sounds awful. Like, I don't know why I'm sick. I don't know what I did against God, but I guess I did something. But having Jesus, having God as our intermediary between us and the Father is just, it's so refreshing to know that we don't have to do that on our own. You remember how I said, God doesn't need us to accomplish his purposes, but he wants us, right? That's why we have Jesus, because God wants us to be with him, and we can't do it by ourselves. So just the fact that God cares enough for us to send his son so that we can be with him and remember him as holy and give him the glory he deserves, I think that's spectacular. I think it's the best story ever written, right? So the Philistines, they never get it. They just ship the ark back off to Israel. It just doesn't click with them. They just don't understand. Maybe God didn't want them to understand. Who knows? But my question to you would be, in closing, is what's your Dagon? What are you putting up against or up next to God in your heart, saying, I can have God, but I also have this other thing that helps dictate my life, right? Spoiler alert: God will decapitate that idol. And it's a lot less painful for you if you say, I don't want the pain and the suffering that God's going to bring in getting this thing out of my life. I'm going to, with God's help, get rid of it myself. That way I don't have to suffer the punishment that God's going to dish out for having this thing in my life. So it's a lot easier to ship that idol out of the temple of your heart before God has a chance to come in and renovate for you. When God renovates, he uses a sledgehammer a lot, and a lot of the time that can be really painful. So just, food for thought. What's your Dagon, right? I think everyone has one. I think, you can think of one pretty easily. So consider that next time maybe you want to indulge in whatever that may be, Do I want to serve this idol or do I want to serve God? And that goes for me too. I'm not perfect. So let's pray. Lord, thank you for today. Thanks that we can all gather here to share your word with each other and to learn from you and from each other. Help us have a good rest of the week, remembering everything we have learned, and bless us in the rest of our day. In your name, amen.